Evan Walker boarded the plane last. Not because he was late, he was always early, but because he waited until the aisle cleared enough to navigate with one hand holding a backpack and the other gently guiding his 6-year-old daughter. Lily clutched her stuffed fox to her chest, eyes wide as she took in the narrow metal tube that would carry them across the country. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging his sleeve, "are we really flying above the clouds?" Evan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the plan, kiddo." "Seat 22B, middle seat, of course." He slid into it carefully, knees brushing the seat in front of him. The fabric smelled faintly of recycled air and spilled coffee. Lily climbed onto his lap without being asked. She always did when she felt unsure, and rested her head against his chest like she'd done 1,000 times before. To anyone watching, Evan looked like exactly what the world assumed he was. A tired single father in a worn gray hoodie, cheap sneakers scuffed at the toes, hands rough from work no one bothered to ask about. His hair was cropped short, uneven like he'd cut it himself. His eyes carried something older than his years, quiet, guarded, unreadable. He buckled Lily in first, always her first. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy suit sighed loudly. Richard Hale adjusted his cufflinks and glanced at his watch, irritation tightening his jaw. He'd paid extra to board early, to settle in, to avoid exactly this kind of inconvenience. He looked at Evan and Lily the way someone looks at an unexpected stain. "Unbelievable," Richard muttered, not quite under his breath. This flight was supposed to be quiet. Evan heard him. He always did. He kept his eyes forward, one arm instinctively wrapping around Lily as if shielding her from words as sharp as knives. Lily stirred slightly, her brow creasing. "You okay?" Evan whispered. She nodded, thumb slipping into her mouth. "I don't like planes when they're loud." "They're just big buses with wings," he said softly, "and buses always get where they're going." The man in the suit leaned toward the aisle, flagging down a flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said, voice polished and impatient. "Is there any chance of relocating them? I have an important meeting when we land." The flight attendant glanced at Evan and Lily, then back at Richard. "Sir, the flight is full." Richard scoffed, "Figures." Evan felt heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not anymore. Not with Lily watching, absorbing, learning how the world treated people like them. He shifted slightly, adjusting Lily's head so it rested more comfortably against him. Her breathing slowed, evened out. She trusted him. That mattered more than pride. Outside the window, rain streaked across the glass, blurring the runway lights into long, trembling lines. The engines hummed as the plane began to taxi. Evan closed his eyes for a brief moment. The sound of the engines always did this to him, took him somewhere else. Somewhere louder. Somewhere sharper. He pushed the memory away. "Daddy," Lily murmured, eyes fluttering open. "Are you scared?" Evan opened his eyes immediately. "No," he said without hesitation. "Are you?" She thought about it a little. "That's okay," he replied. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It just means you don't let fear decide." She smiled faintly and closed her eyes again. Across the aisle, Richard typed furiously on his phone, firing off emails. "Delay unacceptable. Handle this." He paused, glancing again at Evan, at the calm way he held the child, the silence he wore like armor. "People like that always look so resigned," Richard muttered to himself, "like life happened to them." The plane paused at the end of the runway. Cabin lights dimmed slightly, seatbelt signs chimed on. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice announced, warm and rehearsed, "we're number 2 for takeoff. Should be wheels up shortly." Evan tightened his grip on Lily just a fraction, not enough for her to notice, but enough to reassure himself. The engines roared louder. The plane surged forward. Acceleration pressed them back into their seats as the runway lights rushed past in a glowing blur. Lily squeezed her stuffed fox. Evan whispered, "Almost there." The wheels lifted. The ground dropped away. For a brief, fleeting moment, everything felt normal. Then Evan felt it. A subtle vibration, not turbulence, something uneven, something wrong. He opened his eyes, gaze flicking instinctively toward the wing. Nothing visible, yet. Richard reclined his seat, smirking as the city lights shrank below them. "Finally," he said, satisfied, "peace." The seatbelt sign chimed off. The cabin relaxed, people unbuckling, shifting, exhaling. And then, thunk. Not loud, not dramatic, just wrong. The plane shuddered once. Evan's body stiffened instantly. Lily's eyes snapped open. "Daddy." "I've got you," he said, voice steady even as his pulse spiked. The overhead lights flickered. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Another shudder followed, stronger this time, sending a tremor through the floor. A flight attendant stumbled, gripping a seat back. "What was that?" someone asked. Richard laughed nervously. "Probably turbulence." But Evan knew better. This wasn't air. This was mechanical. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, then cut out mid-word, swallowed by static. Silence filled the cabin. A heavy, unnatural silence where the steady roar of engines should have been. Evan's jaw tightened. He wrapped both arms around Lily, pulling her close, shielding her with his body as instinct took over, old instincts he'd hoped never to need again. Somewhere deep within the plane, something went very, very quiet. And high above the clouds, with no one yet understanding what had just failed. Seat 22B was about to matter far more than anyone could imagine. Richard Hale leaned back in his seat, attempting to mask his unease with a condescending smirk. He tapped his fingers on the armrest, the sound sharp, deliberate. This was the moment he thrived in, or at least he liked to think it was. He had always believed control was everything. Control over meetings, over markets, over people's perceptions. And here, in a narrow aluminum tube cruising 30,000 feet above the earth, he assumed he still had it. But something had shifted. The faint tremor in the fuselage, the subtle jerk he had dismissed as turbulence, was growing. He glanced out the window at the wing, expecting the calm sweep of metal and rivets glinting in the moonlight. Everything seemed normal, too normal. "Ridiculous," he muttered to no one, his voice tighter than usual. "This is a Boeing, for heaven's sake. Nothing happens to Boeings." He turned his attention to the man across the aisle. Evan Walker, a single father whose plain hoodie and worn sneakers screamed mediocrity, remained utterly calm. Lily was asleep, resting against his chest, completely unaware of the stir in the cabin. Evan's serenity, in stark contrast to Richard's rising panic, felt infuriating. "Unbelievable," Richard whispered, shaking his head. "How does someone like that even exist? Flying with a child, middle seat, no style, no presence. People like him shouldn't even be on the same plane as me." A flight attendant passed by, her heels clicking sharply against the aisle floor. She offered Richard a polite, weary smile. "Can I get you anything, sir?" "Water," he said quickly, voice sharp. "Make it sparkling," and he hesitated. "Are these people always allowed to bring children on flights? This is absurd." The attendant blinked. "Sir, it's perfectly legal." Richard exhaled loudly, leaning back, fingers tightening around his armrest. "Legal doesn't mean civilized." Meanwhile, Evan felt the subtle vibration again, now stronger, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the heart of the plane. His stomach sank. It wasn't turbulence, not the kind you could shrug off. This was something else. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A lifetime of experience told him what was coming. The captain's voice returned over the speakers, this time more strained, a trace of unease in the carefully measured tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a technical issue. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Cabin crew, report any anomalies immediately. The cabin shifted uncomfortably. Murmurs began, low at first, then louder. People leaned over seats, whispered to one another. Anxiety started to creep into the atmosphere like a slow-moving storm. Richard laughed nervously. Technical issue, what does that even mean? Probably just a sensor glitch. But even as he said it, a flicker of doubt passed over his face. His usual confidence, the shield he carried in boardrooms and gala dinners, felt thin, fragile. Evan's eyes scanned the cabin instinctively. His body had already begun moving on autopilot, his hand brushing Lily's hair back, checking that her seatbelt was secure, nodding the nearest emergency exits. His heart beat faster, but not in panic, in readiness. Suddenly, a sharp jolt ripped through the plane. Cups tumbled from the fold-out trays. A woman screamed somewhere near the back. A man's laptop slid across his lap and clattered to the floor. Richard's face drained of color. He gripped the armrests, knuckles white. What the hell is? The captain's voice came again, now urgent, almost desperate. Ladies and gentlemen, if there are any military pilots, particularly fighter pilots, on board, please identify yourselves to the cabin crew immediately. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Richard froze, mouth half open, staring at Evan. Did he just say fighter pilots? Evan didn't flinch. He kept his hand on Lily's shoulder, feeling the tremor of her small body against his chest. He had hoped he'd never have to say these words again, hoped the past would stay buried. But life has a way of dragging skills out when they're most needed. Richard's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, incredulous. Him, that ordinary man. Evan's jaw tightened. He glanced at Richard once, a brief, unreadable expression, then looked ahead. He didn't answer, not yet. Meanwhile, the passengers were shifting, whispering, panic simmering beneath the surface. Some stared at Evan with disbelief, others with hope. A mother held her child closer. A businessman clutched his briefcase as though it could shield him from the unknown. The subtle hum of the engines had changed. The plane shuddered again, this time violently, tossing the drinks, rattling overhead compartments. Evan leaned slightly forward, feeling the vibrations in his fingertips. His military training, long buried under years of civilian life, awoke. Every muscle, every reflex recognized the signs. Engine anomalies, electrical fluctuations, sudden drops. Richard, meanwhile, pressed his palms to his face, muttering, "This can't be happening, not to me. Not now." A flight attendant passed by, panic threading her voice. "Sir, are you all right?" I'm fine," Richard stammered. He was. He could feel the first tremors of real fear clawing at him, stripping away every ounce of arrogance. Evan's eyes swept the cabin once more, noting positions, observing passengers' reactions, scanning exits and mentally rehearsing 100 possible scenarios. Then, as another shudder ran through the plane, the captain's voice returned, trembling slightly. "Again, if there are any trained pilots on board, anyone who can assist, the situation is urgent. Please contact the cabin crew immediately." The words hit Evan like a shot to the chest. He glanced at Lily, safe for now, and pressed a hand to her back. Calm, protective, silent. Then he rose from his seat. Every head turned toward him. Whispers surged through the cabin like an electric current. "Sir, are you?" a flight attendant asked, voice trembling. Evan's expression was unreadable. "Former U.S. Air Force," he said quietly. "F-16, F-22 certified." The cabin froze. Richard's mouth fell open. He stared at Evan as if seeing him for the first time. Every insult he had thrown, every sneer, every judgment, it all landed back on him, hollow, meaningless. Evan's hand brushed Lily's hair one last time. "Stay here," he whispered. "Be brave." And with that, he walked toward the cockpit. In the aisle, hearts raced. Phones were gripped tightly. Passengers whispered prayers, curses, and silent hopes. Richard Hale sat frozen, trembling, as the quiet man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as ordinary, moved forward with a confidence he couldn't understand, a certainty he couldn't fathom. Behind the cockpit door, alarms blared. Red lights blinked like warning flares. And for the first time in his life, Richard realized that the Seat 22B man might just save them all. The plane lurched violently again, tossing luggage and screams alike into the air. Evan's calm eyes, steady hands, and buried past were the only things standing between survival and catastrophe. And high above the clouds, no one yet knew how close to the edge they had already come. The first signs of panic were subtle. A soft murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Drinks trembled on tray tables, some spilling over, leaving sticky stains. Overhead bins shifted slightly, and the faint smell of burning electronics teased the air. Evan Walker's eyes flicked toward the wing. Nothing appeared amiss, yet instinct screamed louder than sight. He felt the subtle quiver in the fuselage, a vibration that didn't belong to ordinary turbulence. His military training, dormant for years, flared back to life in a pulse of adrenaline. Lily stirred against his chest. "Daddy, I'm scared," she whispered. He pressed a hand to her back, voice calm but firm. "I know, kiddo, I know, but I've got you. I've always got you." Richard Hale across the aisle had grown pale. His suit now felt suffocating, his cufflinks tight against trembling wrists. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, though the words lacked conviction. "Planes don't, they caw." Then it happened. The first engine cut out. The plane shuddered violently. Cups flew from trays. The air rang with a collective gasp. Passengers screamed, some clutching seatbacks, others clinging to children as if they could shield them from the invisible threat. The captain's voice returned over the speakers, strained, shaky, uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a technical failure. Please remain calm, seatbelts fastened." Static swallowed the last words. Evan's hands tightened around Lily. His mind moved faster than his eyes could follow, calculating, remembering every emergency drill, every procedure drilled into him during long nights at the Air Force Academy. This was no rehearsal. This was real, and real meant someone had to act and fast. The plane lurched again, more violently this time. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling, swinging like pendulums in a room full of tension. The flight attendants struggled to secure themselves, bracing against the violent movements. Richard screamed, a sharp panic sound that cut through the murmurs of fear. "Do something," his voice cracked. "This is insane." Evan felt Lily's small body tremble against him. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm right here. You're safe with me." In the aisle, passengers turned, some seeking guidance, others frozen by shock. One woman clutched her rosary, whispering prayers she'd never thought she'd say aloud. Another man held his briefcase over his face as if it could shield him from the approaching disaster. Then a flight attendant, voice quivering, called out, "If there's a trained pilot on board, anyone who can help, please." Her sentence trailed off as the plane pitched violently to one side. Evan knew there was no time to hesitate. He unbuckled his seatbelt, careful to keep Lily secured in his lap until the last second. He passed her to the attendant, who immediately wrapped the child in a protective hold. "Sir," the attendant asked, eyes wide, "are you?" "I'm former Air Force," Evan said, voice low, controlled. "F-16 and F-22 qualified, I can help." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Murmurs swelled into gasps. Richard Hale's jaw dropped, a mixture of disbelief and dawning terror washing over him. The single father he had mocked so publicly was now the only possible salvation for everyone aboard. Evan moved swiftly toward the cockpit, each step measured despite the plane's violent sways. His mind raced, reviewing protocols, remembering sequences of controls and emergency procedures he hadn't touched in years. Muscle memory would guide him now. Logic, precision, and instinct. The cockpit door was ajar and alarms blared inside. Red warning lights flashed like a warning drumbeat, casting harsh shadows across the cramped space. One pilot was slumped forward, oxygen mask dangling uselessly. The other fought the controls, sweat pouring down his face, eyes wide with fear. Evan stepped inside without hesitation. Status. The remaining pilot's voice trembled. We lost the left engine. Right engine is unstable. Hydraulics are failing. Altitude dropping. Altitude? Evan asked, scanning instruments. His eyes absorbed data faster than most could comprehend. 34,000 dropping, the pilot replied. Evan's jaw tightened. Okay, listen carefully. We fly the plane we have, not the one we wish for. Buckle up. We're diverting to the nearest suitable runway. The plane lurched again more violently, pitching downward slightly. Alarms screamed. The cabin shook. Passengers screamed in terror. Drinks spilled, children cried, and panic threatened to overwhelm reason. Richard Hale, across the cabin, could hardly breathe. Every ounce of arrogance he'd carried all these years crumbled into raw, unfiltered fear. He clutched his armrest as if doing so could anchor him to reality. Who is he? Richard muttered to himself. How can he? Inside the cockpit, Evan's hands moved with precision, fingers flying over controls, rerouting systems, manually adjusting hydraulics, calculating trajectories. Each movement measured, each decision deliberate. We'll make it, he said quietly, almost to himself. We have to for her. He glanced toward the small compartment where Lily waited, safe for now. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about survival, it was about life. His life, her life, and the lives of everyone on board. Outside, the sky seemed to close in. Clouds twisted like storm-driven smoke and lightning forked in the distance. But Evan remained focused. He wasn't letting the sky win. Not tonight. The plane dropped another 1,000 feet. Passengers screamed anew. Richard clutched his head in his hands, muttering broken apologies to the universe, to fate, to the man he had scorned. Evan's eyes remained sharp, scanning, calculating. He began to communicate with the pilot, issuing calm, precise instructions. Adjust flaps to 20, compensate with rudder, maintain as much thrust as we have, prepare for emergency descent. The pilot, wide-eyed and pale, nodded, following Evan's instructions as if salvation itself had stepped through the cockpit door. Another violent shudder rattled the cabin, tossing luggage, drinks, and even bodies from their precarious positions. Oxygen masks swayed. A child screamed somewhere in the back. A man's briefcase flew into the aisle. Evan ignored the chaos, focusing only on the instruments and the path ahead. He was calm, a stark contrast to the rising hysteria around him. Every passenger now depended on him, and he would not fail. And then the captain's voice, tense but alive, came over the speaker one last time. If anyone is a trained military pilot, please, this is urgent. Assist us immediately. Evan didn't hesitate. He had already begun. As he gripped the controls, routing the failing systems manually, the full magnitude of what was happening became terrifyingly clear. One wrong move could end everything. One slip, and the plane, the passengers, Lily, all gone. Richard Hale, tears streaming down his face, whispered, "God help us." But Evan didn't need help. Not yet. Not while skill, experience, and instinct were still alive in him. The engines groaned again, the plane dropping another 1,000 feet. Alarms screamed like a chorus of death. Passengers clung to their seats, prayers and curses spilling indistinguishably into the cabin air. And high above the clouds, at 34,000 feet, fate had finally made its demand. Evan Walker rose to meet it. The cockpit door was a threshold Evan Walker had crossed countless times in simulations and combat, but never like this. The smell of burning circuitry mingled with sweat and fear. Alarms screamed. Warning lights pulsed red and orange in a chaotic strobe. Every passenger's life hung in the balance, and the man who had been quietly dismissed across the aisle was now the fulcrum of their survival. One pilot was slumped against the side panel, mask hanging loosely, eyes wide with disbelief. The other gripped the controls with white-knuckled desperation. We can't maintain altitude," the pilot gasped. "Hydraulics are failing. We might." Evan slid into the co-pilot seat, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. He pressed the buttons, toggled the systems, and ran through procedures almost automatically. Every muscle, every nerve, responded with the instinct born from thousands of flight hours and split-second decisions in the Air Force. "Altitude?" Evan asked, voice calm but commanding. 29,000, dropping fast," the pilot replied, panic creeping into his tone. Evan's jaw tightened. "Okay, listen carefully. We fly the plane we have, not the one we want. Diversion to nearest airstrip. Emergency approach. I need you with me, not panicking." The pilot's eyes widened at the tone, a quiet authority that brooked no argument. He nodded, swallowing the lump of fear in his throat. Outside, the night sky was a shifting canvas of clouds and darkness, punctuated by the faint glow of distant lightning. The plane lurched violently, pitching downward. Passengers screamed as the cabin shook. Cups fell, trays rattled, and the overhead compartments rattled ominously. In 22B, Lily's eyes widened, but Evan's calm reassured her. She held the stuffed fox tight, trying to emulate the bravery she saw in her father. Across the aisle, Richard Hale's carefully constructed world shattered. He watched as the man he had mocked, the single father with nothing but a worn hoodie and quiet dignity, moved toward the cockpit with a confidence he could not comprehend. Every arrogant word Richard had ever spoken ricocheted through his mind. He had judged this man on appearance, on social status, on circumstance, and now that judgment meant nothing. Is he?" Richard whispered to the air, eyes fixed on Evan. "Yes," muttered a flight attendant. "That's him, that's the one." Evan's hand brushed the controls, his mind a lightning storm of calculations. Engine failures, hydraulic loss, weight distribution, wind shear, emergency landing protocols, all processed in milliseconds. He had lived for this precision, trained for it, yet he had hoped never to need it again. The plane shuddered violently, tilting to the left. Alarms blared. Lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the pilots' faces. "Flaps at 20, Evan instructed. "Rudder adjustment, compensate. Keep engines at maximum sustainable thrust. Prepare for emergency landing sequence." The pilot nodded, following the commands with trembling hands. Outside, the clouds rushed past like a living wall, dark and unyielding. In the cabin, passengers held on for dear life. A child screamed in the back. A woman whispered frantic prayers. Richard Hale was frozen, trembling, gripping his armrest so tightly his knuckles were white. Evan's eyes flicked to the instruments again. Altitude dropping faster. Ground approaching. He felt the subtle warning vibrations through the floor, metal stress, weight imbalance, mechanical strain. And yet, despite the chaos, he remained steady. "Bring her in," he muttered under his breath, thinking of Lily in the cabin, safe for now. Every calculation, every maneuver was about protecting her, about buying her life. The plane lurched again, violently, tossing passengers and luggage. A soft alarm pinged. The hydraulic pressure was dangerously low. Another warning indicated partial electrical failure. Evan's hands moved faster, routing power manually, compensating for the failed systems. Muscle memory, honed over years in fighter jets, kicked in. His mind became a machine, precise, unstoppable. The co-pilot stared at him in awe. You're handling this like it's routine." Evan didn't answer. Routine or not, lives depended on him. No room for talk, only action. Richard Hale, meanwhile, watched in disbelief. This was the man he had mocked, the man he had dismissed as ordinary, as incapable. And now, this man held the fate of everyone on the plane in his hands. Every ounce of pride and hubris Hale had carried crumbled under the weight of that realization. "Is he really a former fighter pilot?" someone whispered in the aisle. "Yes," another voice confirmed. "He said F-16, F-22 trained." And as murmurs of disbelief and hope spread through the cabin, Evan executed the first critical maneuver. He adjusted the flaps and rudder simultaneously, compensating for hydraulic loss, the plane tilting dangerously as it responded. A violent lurch sent passengers into a coordinated chaos, screams, the sound of objects crashing, a child crying. But Evan's hands never wavered. He corrected the tilt, stabilized the nose, and leveled the aircraft just enough to maintain control. The cockpit's warning lights continued to flash, a chaotic symphony of red and orange, but Evan remained unshaken. He communicated calmly with the pilot, issuing precise instructions, counteracting each failing system. And then a new challenge. The navigation system flickered, failing intermittently. Instruments glitched. Altitude indicators wavered. Evan didn't panic. "Manual override," he said. "Follow my lead. We're flying on instruments and instinct now." The pilot hesitated. "Manual I." "Do it," Evan commanded. "Trust me." The plane continued to descend, the ground approaching faster than anyone dared measure. Lightning flashed through the clouds, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers in brief, ghostly frames. Richard Hale sat frozen, a single tear streaking down his cheek. For the first time in decades, he had no control, no leverage, no power to command, and it terrified him. Meanwhile, Evan calculated the runway's approach in seconds, accounting for wind, turbulence, and mechanical instability. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. The co-pilot whispered, almost in awe, You can actually do this. We might survive this." Evan's lips pressed together, jaw tight. "We will," he said firmly, "but only if you do exactly as I say." Another violent lurch shook the plane, tossing passengers into their seats. Oxygen masks swung. Alarms blared. The roar of wind filled the cabin as the aircraft plummeted closer to Earth. And in that moment, the plane seemed to respond to him, as though it recognized the hands of someone who knew it intimately. Every adjustment, every calculation began to push them towards survival. Richard Hale's world had shifted irrevocably. The man he had scorned, the single father, was now the one who would determine whether they all lived or died. Every ounce of arrogance he had carried shattered like glass under the weight of reality. And outside, high above the darkened landscape, the first sliver of emergency lights from the approaching airstrip cut through the storm clouds. The next few minutes would decide everything. Evan Walker, calm and precise amidst the chaos, prepared for the impossible, to bring a failing plane and terrified passengers safely back to Earth. The cockpit door rattled behind him, a faint echo of the cabin's panic, but inside Evan had one thought, one focus, one unwavering purpose: keep everyone alive. And the storm outside wasn't the only thing they would have to survive. The cockpit smelled of fear, burning electronics and metal that had been stretched past its comfort. Red warning lights pulsed like the frantic heartbeat of a wounded animal. Every alarm screamed a warning, demanding immediate attention, yet no amount of sirens could outpace the pounding of Evan Walker's own pulse, a pulse steady, controlled, and precise. One pilot slumped against the side panel, mask dangling, eyes wide and unfocused. The other gripped the yoke with trembling hands, trying desperately to maintain control as the fuselage shook violently. Instruments flashed intermittently, some showing impossible readings. Systems failed in a cascade that would have terrified any inexperienced hand. Evan slid into the co-pilot's seat, a calm amid the storm. His fingers hovered over the controls for just a moment, assessing, calculating, and then moved with purpose. Each adjustment precise, deliberate. He wasn't thinking about the chaos. He wasn't thinking about the screaming passengers behind him. Only the plane, only the instruments, only the living, breathing metal and air mass that now depended on his touch. "Status?" he asked, voice low but commanding. The pilot to his right stammered. "Left engine is completely offline. Right engine unstable. Hydraulic pressure dropping. If it fails, we'll—" Evan cut him off with a calm authority honed over years of life-or-death decisions. "We don't fail. Not today. I've got this." He reached over, adjusting throttles, rerouting power manually, bypassing systems that had gone dark. Muscle memory surged through him, each motion practiced thousands of times in simulators during exercises and real combat flights. "Altitude?" he asked, eyes scanning instruments like a hawk. 27,000, dropping," the pilot replied, panic creeping into his voice. "Hold her steady. Maximum thrust compensating for hydraulics loss. We're going manual from here. Check instruments constantly." Evan's hands moved over the controls, routing power, overriding failures, calculating every shift in wind, weight, and trajectory. The plane pitched violently, lurching left, then right. Overhead compartments rattled, luggage slid, and the cabin behind them erupted into panic. Passengers screamed, some clutching children, some crossing themselves, all searching for something to anchor their terror. Richard Hale in 22B sat frozen. He hadn't moved in minutes, knuckles gripping the armrests. His jaw worked as he whispered, How is he doing this? He could. And Richard's disbelief only grew as the slumping pilot and panicked co-pilot followed Evan's every command. "Rudder adjust 10 degrees. Flaps at 25. Compensate for the yaw," Evan ordered, his eyes flicking from instruments to the horizon where clouds churned like dark oceans. The co-pilot's voice trembled. I've never seen anyone fly like this without full control systems." "Then watch," Evan said calmly, "and follow instructions exactly." He adjusted the nose slightly, countered the pitch, and the plane responded, obedient to hands that knew it intimately. Another violent shudder ran through the fuselage, jostling the controls, rattling the cockpit panels, tossing the pilot against the wall. Yet Evan's hands never faltered. "Keep her level. Check hydraulics. Prepare for emergency landing sequence," he said. He routed more power to the remaining systems manually, ignoring warnings, improvising calculations that would have taken engineers minutes to compute. He did it in seconds. In the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. Murmurs rose into whispers of awe. Passengers peeked toward the cockpit, some daring to hope. Mothers held children tighter, fathers gritted their teeth, and Richard Hale's mind raced in a storm of regret and fear. He had spent decades believing he understood power, but here was true authority, not in wealth or title, but in calm decisiveness and skill under pressure. Outside, the sky became a war zone of clouds and lightning. Wind sheer tore across the wings, and turbulence threatened to rip the aircraft apart. Evan accounted for it all. His calculations were fluid, instinctive, precise. "Gear?" he asked the pilot, already knowing the answer. "Not deployable yet. Hydraulic failure," came the reply. "Then we do it manually." "Override," Evan said, and guided the system into emergency deployment, watching the indicators closely as the landing gear extended with a grinding protest. The plane shuddered violently again, but stability returned, enough for the moment. Evan scanned the instruments. The artificial horizon flickered, but he compensated with raw instinct, eyes flicking between altimeter, airspeed indicator, and engine readouts. "Throttle adjust +10. Left engine minimal, compensate with rudder, stay with me." The co-pilot's hands moved like marionettes, following precise commands. I can't believe it's working." "It has to," Evan said, jaw tight, eyes sharp. "We have lives to save." Richard Hale sat transfixed. His arrogance, his condescension, even his wealth and power, none of it mattered now. The man he had mocked, quiet, ordinary, single father, was controlling forces that could destroy everything with a single misstep, and he was doing it flawlessly. In the cabin, Lily's small voice whispered, "Daddy." Evan glanced back briefly, offering her a small, reassuring nod, then returned focus to the instruments, to the plane, to survival itself. Another violent lurch. Alarms screamed. Metal groaned. The passengers screamed anew, some praying, some screaming curses, some too stunned to react. "Prepare for final approach," Evan instructed. "Steady descent, manual control only, runway in sight." He adjusted the flaps, controlled the pitch, compensated for the failing hydraulics, the failing engine, the chaos of the storm, and the desperate weight of every human life aboard. Every calculation precise, every movement purposeful. The co-pilot stared at him in awe. You're saving us." Evan didn't answer. There was no time, there was only now. The runway lights appeared through a thinning veil of storm clouds, faint but alive, like a distant promise. He adjusted speed, angle, and altitude with the calm precision of a seasoned fighter pilot, eyes never leaving instruments for more than a fraction of a second. Richard Hale's hands trembled. He swallowed hard, whispering apologies to everyone around him, to life itself. He had judged the man in seat 22B so completely, and now he understood just how wrong he had been. Another violent jolt. Alarms blared. Warning lights flashed in urgent, chaotic patterns. The plane pitched dangerously. Passengers screamed. Evan's hands moved faster, fingers dancing over switches, throttles, and manual overrides. Systems failed one by one. Lights flickered. Instruments glitched. Yet through it all, he maintained control. The impossible was still possible. "Keep her steady," he murmured. "We're almost there." The plane descended toward the runway, engines screaming their final protest. Winds roared. Lightning cracked. Clouds swirled like molten shadows. Evan's hands remained steady, his eyes sharp, mind a storm of calculations, instincts, and raw courage. The lives of everyone aboard, including his daughter, now rested entirely on the man he had once believed was powerless. Outside, the runway lights grew brighter, cutting through the storm. The emergency landing sequence was underway. And high above, the night sky waited, silent and judgmental, for what would happen next. The cockpit was a war zone of red lights, alarms, and the deafening roar of failing machinery. Every system that had once made flying routine was now a potential death sentence. Yet Evan Walker's hands moved with the precision of a surgeon, eyes flicking from instrument to instrument, brain processing 1,000,000 calculations per second. "Hydraulics are at 20%, the slumping pilot gasped, his voice tight with fear. "If we lose that, we can't steer, can't brake, can't." Evan didn't flinch. "Then we don't lose it," he said calmly, though his heart hammered. "Adjust manually, follow my lead, every second counts." Outside the cockpit windows, the storm raged. Lightning flashed in jagged white streaks across the sky, illuminating the twisted clouds. Rain pelted the fuselage, the sound a relentless drumbeat that matched the tension in the cabin. Evan's mind ran through contingencies at lightning speed. Manual override for the landing gear, rudder compensation for uneven thrust, adjusted flaps for compromised hydraulics, altitude calculations, weight distribution, wind shear, turbulence. Each factor a potential fatal variable, each adjustment a gamble with life itself. "Engage emergency landing protocol," he commanded. "Throttle up, maintain as much lift as possible. Steady descent, eyes on instruments, not the storm." The co-pilot's hands trembled as they followed instructions. I can't believe we're still in the air," he admitted. "Believe it," Evan replied sharply, "or you're done." Meanwhile in the cabin, passengers held on for dear life. A child screamed somewhere near the back. Mothers clutched children, whispering prayers and shushing tears. Fathers gritted their teeth, praying silently, praying for a miracle. And Richard Hale sat frozen, every ounce of arrogance drained, replaced by raw, unfiltered terror. He had mocked Evan, dismissed him as a failure, and now he watched the man he had underestimated literally fight death itself with nothing but skill, instinct and courage. The plane lurched violently. Oxygen masks swung like pendulums. Overhead compartments rattled. The fuselage groaned under the stress, as if protesting the impossible task Evan had taken upon himself. Evan's eyes were sharp, unblinking, focused. Flaps at 30, compensate for rudder drift, adjust nose slightly left, throttle increase 5%, manual control engaged. The co-pilot mirrored the movements, following Evan's precise instructions. Outside, the runway lights were still faint, obscured by thick clouds and driving rain. The plane pitched again, violently, tossing passengers and luggage in the cabin. Screams echoed like a chorus of panic, but Evan's calm remained a counterpoint, a steadying force against chaos. "We're cutting it close," the slumping pilot said, voice trembling. "If we miscalculate by even a fraction, we'll—" "Not miscalculating," Evan said, jaw tight. "We survive this. Focus." He adjusted the flaps again, compensating for failing hydraulics. The plane responded, groaning but obedient. A violent lurch threw the co-pilot against the side panel, but he regained control under Evan's steady instructions. "Prepare for final approach," Evan said. "Stay with me. Eyes on instruments, don't look outside, don't think about the ground yet. Think only about control. Control is survival." Richard Hale's hands were trembling now, knuckles white. He watched as Evan manipulated the failing aircraft, correcting every deviation, countering every system failure, stabilizing the plane in a storm that should have destroyed it. Every arrogant assumption Hale had ever held shattered. The man in seat 22B wasn't just competent, he was extraordinary. The storm outside intensified. Wind shear threatened to rip the plane from its path. Turbulence tossed the fuselage violently. The remaining engine groaned under the strain. Every warning light was illuminated, every alarm screaming. Evan ignored it all. He had no time for fear, no time for hesitation. Every decision mattered. Every second counted. "Gear down manually," he ordered. The co-pilot moved quickly, following precise steps. Metal ground and creaked as the landing gear deployed against failing hydraulics. A tense silence filled the cockpit for a heartbeat, then the indicators confirmed deployment. "Good, keep steady, throttle adjust, compensate, keep her level," Evan said. The plane lurched violently again. Alarms screamed. Instruments flickered. Outside, the runway lights appeared briefly, obscured by sheets of rain. Evan calculated angle, speed, altitude, and trajectory in an instant. "We're too fast," the co-pilot said, fear in his voice. "No," Evan replied. "We're alive. That's what matters. Adjust for wind, not speed. Compensate manually." Every movement, every command was executed flawlessly. Evan's calm was almost unnatural, a beacon of certainty in a maelstrom of terror. Behind him, the cabin continued to sway violently. Children screamed, adults prayed, and yet the passengers began to sense something they hadn't felt before: hope. It was faint, fragile, but undeniable. They were not at the mercy of the storm. They were being guided by one man, one ordinary-looking man with extraordinary skill. Richard Hale's face was pale, his eyes wide. He had spent decades in boardrooms, thinking himself in control of everything. And here he was, powerless, witnessing true competence in action. Evan adjusted the nose slightly, compensating for the failing hydraulics and uneven thrust. The plane responded, groaning but obedient. "Landing sequence in 5 seconds," he said quietly. "Steady hands, calm minds, we'll get there." The co-pilot mirrored his movements, eyes wide with awe and terror. Outside, the storm raged, but Evan remained focused. Every adjustment precise, every calculation exact. The runway lights cut through the storm again, growing brighter. He adjusted descent angle, compensated for wind shear, and calculated the final approach. Passengers gripped seats, bracing for impact. Richard Hale whispered a broken apology, tears streaking down his face. He had judged Evan, mocked him, and now he owed him his life. The plane continued its descent, engines groaning, alarms blaring, but Evan's hands were steady. He was the eye of the storm, the calm that would guide them through chaos. And as the runway grew closer, as every system screamed in protest, Evan knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not fail. Not for Lily. Not for the passengers. Not for anyone who had placed their lives in his hands. The storm was relentless. The plane was wounded. But Evan Walker, the mocked single father, the forgotten pilot, would not quit. And high above, the night sky waited, holding its breath for the impossible to unfold. The runway appeared like a fragile lifeline through the storm, slicing through sheets of rain and darkness. Evan Walker's eyes were locked on the instruments, yet he could see every flash of light from the airstrip, every reflection on the wet tarmac. The plane groaned under the stress, metal screaming as hydraulics strained against gravity, wind, and failing systems. "Gear confirmed," the co-pilot said, voice trembling. "Manual override held, wheels down." Evan nodded slightly. "Good, keep her steady, throttle adjust slightly back, maintain lift, nose neutral, rudder compensate for yaw." The plane pitched violently, tossing the co-pilot against the console. Alarms screamed, blinking lights illuminating the cockpit like a war zone. Evan's hands never faltered. Each movement precise, instinctive, executed with the calm ferocity of someone who had survived death before and knew how to negotiate with it. Behind him, the cabin was chaos, screams mixed with prayers. Children clutched parents. Adults grabbed seats and straps as if those flimsy materials could anchor them to reality. Richard Hale's face was pale and streaked with tears. Every ounce of arrogance, every sneer, every judgment he had ever delivered toward Evan Walker dissolved completely. He watched in awe and terror as the man he had mocked manipulated a wounded plane through an impossible descent. "Runway in sight," the co-pilot said. "Approach looks manageable." Evan's eyes didn't leave the instruments. He could see it, the distance, the descent angle, the speed. Every miscalculation now would be catastrophic, but he didn't hesitate. There was no time. Hesitation was death. Throttle maintain, nose slightly up, compensate rudder for wind shear. The plane shuddered violently. Lightning flashed, illuminating the terror-stricken faces in the cabin through the small cockpit windows. Rain pelted the fuselage in unrelenting sheets. The engines groaned, straining beyond their limits, threatening to fail completely. "Hold together," Evan muttered under his breath. "Just a little further." The co-pilot's hands mirrored his, trembling but precise, following every adjustment. They were a team, bound by the unspoken understanding of life and death. Suddenly, the left engine sputtered, coughing and wheezing. Warning lights blared red. Hydraulic pressure dropped further. The fuselage pitched again violently, tossing both pilots against their harnesses. "Left engine's gone," the pilot shouted. "Compensate with right," Evan barked. "We're not done yet." The plane lurched toward the ground. Trees, buildings, and lights of the airport blurred past in the rain-soaked night. Each second felt like a lifetime. The cabin behind them creaked and groaned with the strain, passengers screaming in terror and hope simultaneously. Richard Hale gripped the armrests until his knuckles were white. He dared not look away. Every second, every movement, every decision by Evan Walker could mean the difference between life and death. "Flaps maxed," Evan said. "Rudder full compensation, nose slightly up. We glide in." The co-pilot adjusted frantically, following Evan's commands as if his own survival depended on it, because it did. The plane pitched violently again, rocking in the wind, but Evan's eyes were fixed, unwavering. Passengers were screaming now, some in prayer, some in blind panic. Mothers clutched children, fathers whispered silent apologies to the universe. Lily, strapped safely in her seat, squeezed her stuffed fox and whispered, "Daddy." Evan's jaw tightened. "Hold on, kiddo, Daddy here." The ground raced up beneath them. The plane was wounded, systems failing, engines groaning, hydraulics weak, Yet Evan maneuvered with surgical precision. He calculated descent angle, speed, wind, lift, and drag simultaneously. Every factor was a potential death sentence, and yet he corrected, adjusted, balanced, fought the storm with calm authority. "Prepare for touchdown," he instructed. "Throttle back, maintain lift, nose up steady, steady." The plane pitched again, violently. Rain hammered the windows. Lightning cracked across the night sky. The runway was moments away, but any miscalculation now would be fatal. "Runway 500 feet," the co-pilot shouted. Evan's hands flew over the controls, adjusting throttles, rudder, and flaps. The plane shuddered as it hit the tarmac, wheels touching down with a grinding scream of metal and friction. Alarms continued to blare, but the aircraft held together. Passengers screamed in relief and terror simultaneously. The plane bounced once, twice, then began to slow. Evan maintained control, adjusting brakes manually, routing every bit of hydraulic power remaining. "Hold her steady, keep her aligned," he shouted, voice slicing through the chaos. The plane skidded across the wet runway, tires spraying water, wings quivering under the strain. Passengers braced, some screaming, some praying, some sobbing uncontrollably. Richard Hale had tears streaming down his face. He was witnessing the impossible, the improbable, the miraculous. Evan guided the plane through its final few hundred feet. The engines groaned and coughed, warning lights blared their final protests, and then, slowly, the aircraft came to a stop. Silence. Then applause, tears, laughter, and sobs erupted throughout the cabin. Survivors embraced, held children, whispered prayers and thanks. Lily's small voice called Daddy. Evan exhaled, exhausted beyond comprehension. He unbuckled his harness and carefully made his way to the rear of the cabin. He lifted Lily from the flight attendant's arms, holding her tight. "It's okay, kiddo. We're safe." Richard Hale approached him slowly, tears streaking his face, legs shaking. I judged you, I was wrong," he stammered. Evan looked at him calmly, exhaustion in his eyes but no anger. "Life does that sometimes," he said quietly. "Sometimes it humbles us." Outside, emergency crews swarmed the runway, flashing lights, hoses, and vehicles converging. Inside, the cabin was filled with the shaky, joyous chaos of survival. Evan held Lily close. She clung to him, whispering, "You saved us, Daddy." Evan smiled faintly, pressing his forehead to hers. "We saved each other," he murmured. And yet, even as the plane sat safely on the tarmac, emergency lights reflecting off the rain-soaked fuselage, another signal vibrated in his pocket. A call he had long ignored, a call he thought was behind him. "Unknown number." Evan answered, voice steady but weary. "Walker." "This is Air Force Command," the voice said. "We've been tracking your status. We heard what you did tonight. Are you available for a discussion about returning?" Evan looked at Lily safe in his arms, the chaos of survival around them. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of possibility, an opportunity he had not expected, a path that fate had reopened. Some calls, he realized, come exactly when you are ready to answer them. And in the storm's wake, Evan Walker knew he had not only survived, but had proven that courage, skill, and determination could defy even the most impossible odds. The tarmac buzzed with activity. Emergency crews swarmed around the wounded plane, their flashlights cutting through the sheets of rain, reflecting off the polished fuselage. Hoses hissed, tires crunched on the wet surface, and the smell of fuel mixed with ozone from the storm. Passengers stumbled out of the cabin, clinging to each other, some crying, some laughing, some unable to comprehend the miracle they had just survived. Evan Walker stood near the exit, holding Lily tightly in his arms. Her small head rested against his chest, damp hair plastered to her forehead, but her eyes were bright with trust and awe. "Daddy," she whispered, voice trembling, "you saved everyone." Evan kissed the top of her head. "We saved each other, kiddo, remember that." Richard Hale shuffled toward them, still pale, still shaken. His expensive suit was soaked, sleeves clinging to his arms, but nothing could conceal the raw emotion etched across his face. Every ounce of arrogance, every cruel word he had hurled at Evan, had been stripped away in the hours above the clouds. I owe you everything," Richard stammered, voice breaking. "I judged you, I mocked you, and you saved our lives." Evan nodded slightly, eyes tired but steady. "Life doesn't care about judgment, Mr. Hale. Only actions matter." Behind them, the emergency crews were escorting the last passengers to safety. Parents clutched children, strangers embraced, and murmurs of disbelief and gratitude filled the night air. The storm had passed, leaving a wet, trembling world in its wake, but survival had been claimed, against impossible odds. Evan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, wet fingers pressing the screen. Unknown number. He hesitated for a brief moment. This was a world that demanded caution, where even a single call could change everything. "Walker," he answered, voice calm, weary but alert. "Evan, this is Colonel Jenkins, Air Force Command," the voice on the other end said. "We've been tracking your situation. Your actions tonight, the reports are extraordinary. We need you to come in. There are opportunities we want to discuss." Evan's jaw tightened. Memories he had buried surged unbidden, long hours in the cockpit, missions that demanded everything, losses that had never fully healed. The life he had chosen after the Air Force, the quiet civilian life, the role of a single father surviving day to day, seemed suddenly fragile, almost temporary. "I'm available," he said finally. "Where do you need me?" Jenkins hesitated. "That's not even the question. The real question is, are you willing?" Evan's eyes fell on Lily, watching her small hands clutch the fox she had refused to let go of during the flight. Her life had depended on him tonight. Hundreds of lives had depended on him. And now, fate, in its relentless, unpredictable way, was calling him again. "I'll come," he said quietly. "I'll be there." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The rain continued to fall in a soft drizzle, washing the tarmac clean, the storm now a memory. Emergency crews guided passengers away, their movements efficient but subdued. Survivors spoke in low, awed tones, some still clinging to disbelief. Richard Hale approached again, hesitating, then offering a hand. I don't know what to say," he admitted. You were unbelievable up there. Words fail me." Evan shook his head. "Actions speak louder." He squeezed Lily's hand gently and looked toward the dark horizon, where the storm clouds still lingered but the first hints of dawn were breaking. "That's all that matters." The passengers who had witnessed the landing began to gather outside, faces pale, eyes wide, but alive. Cameras and phones captured fragments of history. The single father who had taken control of a failing aircraft and returned every soul aboard safely to the ground. Among them, a young boy whispered to his mother, "Daddy, can we be brave like him?" Evan's chest tightened. Bravery wasn't about heroics or medals. It was about standing when others would fall, doing what had to be done, and protecting those who could not protect themselves. He looked at Lily and nodded, silently teaching her what courage truly meant. The Air Force had called, but tonight, Evan realized that his life had already changed. He had proven to himself that the man he was, the quiet, overlooked single father, was capable of extraordinary things. And in doing so, he had reminded the world that courage often wears the face of ordinary people. As the sun began to rise, the wet tarmac reflected the first streaks of light. Emergency crews finished their checks, passengers were guided to transport, and the storm's fury receded into history. The world had paused for a moment, held its breath, and Evan Walker had delivered it safely back to its rhythm. Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, are we going home now?" He smiled, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Home," he said, and for a fleeting moment, amidst the chaos of the night and the miraculous survival, home felt like more than a place. It was the safety he had carved out with skill, courage, and love. Richard Hale lingered nearby, still in disbelief, but he had learned something tonight he would never forget. Appearances, status, and wealth were meaningless in the face of true ability and resolve. Evan's phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Air Force Command. "We need to meet immediately. Your skills are needed. History was made tonight." He slipped it into his pocket, eyes scanning the horizon. The sky was clearing, clouds breaking, light spilling through. Life continued, fragile and unpredictable, but Evan Walker had shown that ordinary people could confront the extraordinary and survive. He looked down at Lily, her small face bright with trust and admiration. He had faced death, chaos, and the storm, and he had returned to her. That, more than anything, was victory. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this night wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. For the single father who had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed, the world had just opened its doors. A call to courage, to skill, to purpose, and he would answer. As dawn painted the sky in hues of gold and silver, Evan Walker took a deep breath, held his daughter close, and stepped forward. The storm was behind him, but the possibilities ahead were limitless. And somewhere on that same horizon, the future waited, for heroism, for courage, and for a man who had proven that the quiet ones often carry the greatest strength. The world had seen him, and it would never forget.